Hello everyone. In this video we're going to talk about getting started with using a form online. So we'll talk more about this as we progress through our slides here, but when we're talking about forms in this sort of way, in general, when we're talking about forms, we use forms to get data from our users, and we take the data and we pass it to a database, or we take the data and we do something else with it. But for our purposes and the scope of this course, all we're really going to be talking about is how to make the forms themselves. So just the HTML markup to create the forms and then style the forms. So it's just about the front end code behind the forms. In later courses, you'll go in depth about how to work with the forms to send data to databases and do things with the data. But for the time being, all we're talking about is how we create forms with HTML. So the first question that we need to ask ourselves really is, well, what are forms? So forms are an essential part of the internet, really. They provide a way for websites to capture information from users and to process requests. And they offer controls for nearly every imaginable use of an application. Through controls or fields, forms can request a small amount of information, often a search query or a username and password, or even a large amount of information like shipping and billing addresses, or even an entire job application. And we can request that from a user and get it and put it into a database or use it in other ways. So forms give us a lot of flexibility in what we can do with things online. So why forms? We need to know how to build forms in order to acquire user input. So we'll discuss how to use HTML to mark up a form, which elements to use to capture different types of data, and how to style forms with CSS. So we won't go too deep again into how information from a form is processed and handled on the back end of a website. That's not within the scope of this course. Form processing is a deeper topic outside the scope of what we're doing. So for now, we're just going to do the creation and styling of forms. When you get to later courses, you'll have all of the form processing that you can stand. For the time being, none of that. So let's talk about initializing a form. So to add a form to a page, we'll use the form element. So the form element identifies where on a page the control elements will appear. So additionally, the form element also wraps all of the elements that are included within our form. Like a section element or a div element or a main element. We take and we contain all of our other elements within this form element. And we have a handful of different attributes that can be applied to our form element, the most common of which are action and method attributes. So the action attribute contains the URL to which information included within the form will be sent for processing by the server. And the method attribute is the HTTP method browsers should use to submit the form data. So both of these form attributes pertain to the submitting and processing of data. So again, we're not really particularly concerned about these for the scope of this course. So we're not really going to use them, but I want you to be aware of them and I want you to see what they look like in context. Right now, more for knowledge than anything else. Right, so let's see what these form tags look like in a code example. So we have here our pair of form tags. So it's just an opening and a closing form tag, really simple. And we have our action and method attributes here. We're using the post method and we're sending our action to the login page. You'll learn more about that in the future. For right now, the big thing is that we're just we just need the opening and closing form tag. We can kind of push the action in the method kind of to the side. So in seeing that our form tags are really, really simple, they're probably a little too simple to just have that be enough for this video. So let's talk about the other thing that we want to talk about for this video, and that's one of the most common things that you see in a form, and that's a text field. So one of the primary elements used to obtain text from users is the input element. So a lot of stuff that we'll talk about is based around the input element. So the input element uses the type attribute to define what type of information is to be captured within the control. And the most popular type attribute value is text. And that's your standard text field, and that denotes a single line of text input. So along with setting a type attribute, it is a best practice to give the input element a name. The name attribute value is used as the name of the control and is submitted along with the input data to the server so that it basically knows where the data is coming from, kind of puts a name with the data, and so you can kind of keep track of everything. Otherwise, you just kind of have data that's just kind of thrown out there. So let's have a look at this. So input attribute, or input element with the attributes of type and name. And our type is text, and our name is username. And we can name it whatever we want. So let's jump over to a code pen here. And I'm going to zoom in so that you can see a little bit better what I type in here. So let's start out with our form element. And we're going to add the action and method, but we're just going to leave it with empty quotes because we don't really have an action or method to give this. So for the time being, we're just going to throw that in there just for best practices, even though we don't have an action or method. So we're just going to leave empty quotes as the value to our action attribute and our method attribute. And we're going to close our form tag. And so as you can see, if I go down to my live part of my code pen here, there's nothing here. Form on its own doesn't render anything. Essentially just a form is just a container. It's just a container element. So in addition to providing this information from our action attributes and method attributes, the only real thing that our form tags do is say everything that is in here is the form. So let's go ahead and add our input element here. We'll add our input element. We'll give it a type of text because that's what we're dealing with here. In our next video, we'll have a look at a few different types of input elements. Some newer input elements that were added in with HTML5. And we'll give it a name of username. And you can already see here that we have a little rectangle that's been rendered for us, and we can click into that box and we can get some information. But it's an empty box, so on its own here, it's kind of hard to discern what we want to do. In a later video, we'll talk more about the label element. But for the time being, let's add another attribute to our input element. And we can add the placeholder attribute. And the placeholder attribute is what kind of gives the text fields. If you've seen the text fields online that have the ghost text in them that say what you should put into the box, that's our placeholder. So I can add a placeholder of username. And we can see this kind of ghost text of username appear in our box. And that allows us, that gives your user some indication as to what they should put in there. And Later on, we'll talk about how to use the label attribute to, or the label element to work with these form fields even further. So I think that's enough to get us started with form fields and getting started with forms. We've got a really basic form here. So in future videos, we will just expand on forms from here. So that's all that I have for you for this video. Thank you for watching.